How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the Shot Clock Podcast. Today I have Jeremiah Johnson on, Pacers sideline reporter, Fox Sports, Indiana reporter. Jeremiah, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Nathan. I'm glad we were able to do this, and it's great to be able to talk basketball in the middle of May.
Yeah, I mean, you've been out of work for a while since we've obviously been reporting a little bit, but since about March 11th, the Pacers season was postponed. So what have you been doing to kind of keep yourself busy with all this reporting?
Well, if you're watching this and not just listening, what I've not been doing is shaving. I'm getting a little scraggly on the beard, but I've been enjoying some Sideline Guys podcasts with Pat Boylan. We've been able to talk to maybe 6 or 7 of the players over the last month, just kind of catching up with them and seeing what they've been up to and getting their thoughts on the season, similar to what you're doing here with me. Other than that, as we recorded this, today was my last day as an e-learning teacher in Zionsville. I have a 5th grader and a 1st grader, so I've been trying to keep them, up to their studies. And so today was the last day of school. So we're kind of in a little bit of a celebratory mood here as well. So I'm not sure how I'm going to pass some of the time the next few weeks when we don't have the e-learning to keep us busy. But other than that, trying to exercise, bike rides, and watch some shows. I've enjoyed The Last Dance over the last 5 weeks. But other than that, not a whole lot, nothing crazy to speak of.
Yeah, the Reggie Miller episode, I believe that was episode 10, the final one. That'd be pretty enjoyable for you to watch. So what was your thoughts on that episode?
I was really looking forward to it, even though I knew the outcome was maybe one that was a little bit painful, because that 1998 season I was in college. And so I'd kind of lived and died with every moment of the Pacers playoff runs up to that point growing up in central Indiana, and to have them get so close and have that chance in 1998 to go to the finals and then to come up short. I found myself wanting, obviously, a little more Pacers perspective and a little more Pacers coverage. And I almost started thinking it would be great if we had some of the Pacers behind the scenes footage from this series or this year, and we could put our own little Pacers.com or Fox Sports Indiana documentary together. But I understood that it was kind of all about Michael Jordan. And so some of the images and the games and even that interaction between Michael Jordan and Larry Bird after Game 7 was kind of priceless. So it has been nice to have that series to look forward to each Sunday night, and I've enjoyed watching it with my son. So we've been watching the PG version on ESPN2, but I've even caught some of the replays to catch some of them a second time, because you do miss some things when you only watch it one time.
So you mentioned a Pacers documentary that you wish that they would have some Pacers behind the scene footage. So if you guys had to make a documentary, what would you do that on with the Pacers?
Well, I just think that some of the things that we saw in the documentary are things that I'm privileged to see, at least up to this point in my career, being able to travel with the team and to go to the practices, but a lot of other people don't. So not one thing specifically, but I do think it would be interesting if teams would decide to document a season, especially not every year, but maybe like every 3 or 4 years, of different teams, almost like HBO does with Hard Knocks. But if maybe 2 or 3 teams a year add some cameras and they kind of keep the footage until the year ends, almost the NFL film style, where they have those features that kind of recap a season, but that's more on what happens during the game and some of that footage. I just think that people would be really interested to see some of the behind the scenes footage. Now, that being said, sometimes airplane footage and hotel footage, that there's some privacy and some things that the players don't want to have to be in the public all the time. But I do think the end result would be more interest on the teams and the personalities. And if you didn't wait so long to air it, I think there could be some value there. So that is one of the things in the last few weeks we've had more time to think about ideas and discussions. And I wonder if the NBA might be interested in choosing to do that with more teams moving forward. And I think the Pacers have had, over the last, even if you look at the last 5 or 6 years, they've had some compelling storylines and some characters that maybe people outside of Indiana aren't as aware of, because sometimes what happens here is a little bit under the radar. But you just think back to a season where you're kind of following Lance Stephenson around for a few weeks, and you could have some great stories there.
I think I remember you were telling me you went up with Lance Stephenson in New York at the ISB conference. Is that true? You went up there with him, right?
I don't remember that story specifically. Just being with him or being with them, on the road during some of those seasons, and when he would play at Brooklyn and the Knicks, but not a specific road trip just with Lance.
But a little bit about your career itself. How did you kind of get into this career? What was your first start?
So when I was in college, obviously I was into all forms of sports and broadcasting, and I went to Ball State. And growing up where I did, I could watch the newscasts from Fort Wayne, Lafayette, South Bend, and Indianapolis, and so I had a good sampling of sportscasters that I kind of looked up to. And I was someone who was into 620, watching that daily sportscast, and at 1120 the recaps and even the Friday night shows. Even though where we were situated, we were not often featured for my school's highlights on a Friday night basketball or football show. I loved the presentation and I loved watching that. So I kind of always was dreaming, not necessarily about working for ESPN, but I wanted to be a sports director in Indianapolis and to cover the teams in Indiana that I grew up kind of cheering for, and understanding that you would not be a fan as much, but you would be a reporter. But I kind of am an Indiana person. So my goals and dreams have always been to be, in Indianapolis. And my first TV job coming out of college was in Eastern Kentucky, Hazard, Kentucky. And then after a short stint there, was able to get on in Terre Haute. And at Terre Haute, Channel 2, I was able to broadcast Indiana State basketball as a sideline reporter. So that was such a great experience because I got that sideline reporting experience. I also hosted a coach's show in addition to the weekend sports anchor duties, which, was the primary job. And then from there, went to Indianapolis and got hired by Fox 59 and was able to cover so many different things. And toward the end of my time there, was able to transition over to the team side of things and have been with the Pacers for 6 years now.
You mentioned sideline reporting for high schoolers. So what was that difference is like from doing NBA games to high school games? So,
in a way, the storytelling is similar, and just kind of the way you do your job and you prepare. You obviously have so many more stats available and research that you can do in the NBA. But one of the things that I try to do is to tell personal stories and interactions from conversations with players and coaches. And that's a lot more of what you're able to do at a high school or at a college level. And so in the end, it's very similar. It's just about getting the repetitions and being comfortable and, the timing of it. When you're a sideline reporter, it's really important to have a message that you're trying to get out there, but not to be too long-winded, and to, then get out in a proper way and just be able to kind of hit the delivery of it. And so the first, times that I did it, and I'm sure early on in my time doing it for Indiana State University, I was, probably very raw, but you continue to get practice and you continue to get better. And now it's a little bit second nature. And so I still actually enjoy being able to work on the IHSAA Champions Network, and I respect those state championship events so much, no matter the sport. And when I'm able to fit that in and around the Pacers schedule, I enjoy doing that on Fox Sports Indiana. So whether it's volleyball or softball or baseball or football or basketball, I enjoy getting to do that still. It takes me back to my roots a little bit. But the reality is it's not a lot different. There are a lot more at an NBA broadcast. There are a lot more people involved and a lot more pressure, probably a lot more eyeballs. But as long as you're doing a college game or a high school game, if you have the same mindset and the same mentality, then really it shouldn't be that much different.
A little bit, you mentioned going back to your roots with volleyball, baseball, and everything with that. Have you ever gotten to commentate or done anything else within the field of broadcasting for sports?
Yes. I mean, I mentioned the background of, being a sports anchor, and when you sometimes come out of college or your first jobs, even if you want to do something like I am doing, you have to have those reps. And a lot of times the small market TV stations, even though the business is changing a little bit, and some stations aren't, devoting as many resources into covering sports as compared to news and weather, the smaller stations, it's still a really big deal to them. And I think too, Terre Haute and Hazard, Kentucky, and those markets, sports is a big deal. And so, in those markets, you learn to do everything. And that's where, when I was in Indianapolis, even though I was on the air, I would sometimes produce the Sunday night show. And that actually helped get me to the position with the Pacers, because my very first job with the Pacers was the pregame show producer. And while it was much different than anything I had ever done, because I had produced 30-minute shows at Fox 59, it did give me enough experience putting shows together, rundowns, timing things out, that I was able to transition. while I'm doing the sideline reporting, I obviously, like many, maybe have some aspirations of trying to do play-by-play. It's somewhat difficult to get practice and reps during an NBA season because there are games 4 nights a week and travel, and then you still have to have a family life as well. So I don't have as much time for that. Usually within any season, I can manage to get 2 or 3 high school or college type of games just to get some practice. But I'm probably a little bit of ways yet from being comfortable enough to be a play-by-play person on a bigger level. But I've still been able to do that on the side a little bit. I was able to be the play-by-play for the Class A state finals in 2019, and also Class A football state finals in 2019. And I've also done a little bit of color commentary on the side for the ISC Sports Network. So just a few things on the side, try to focus on, what I do and what I do best. Actually, the one thing that I will bring up that I did that was probably the biggest challenge that I've had in my career was last summer. I filled in as a horse racing announcer at Indiana Grand one night, and it was quarter horse night, and completely different than anything I'd ever done, although I am a fan of the sport and I've watched it enough that it wasn't as difficult for me as it might be for some. It still was a change. And so the first couple of races, I wasn't really sure how I did, but like anything else, I think there were 10 races that night. And by the end, I was feeling pretty good and ready to do it again. I've only gotten that one opportunity because kind of like with my job, I don't miss much work, neither does the regular announcer. But if he needs to be off again, maybe I'll get the call.
So with the horse racing, how did you kind of prepare for that? It's out of your usual zone, basketball, football, and everything else, but horse racing so much different. So how did you prepare?
Well, the one thing that, I'm actually pretty good at reading a program and kind of understanding who, what numbers and names. But for the ones that I was doing, if you think to like the Kentucky Derby or when they go all the way around, this was quarter horse night, which they're basically just going for probably about, 10 to 11 seconds just on the straightaway, and it's a mad dash. So the way I was able to do that is watch some other races on TV and practice calling before I was able to, have that opportunity and almost have the program and have some names and have some practice along the way. So you basically, it's similar to basketball. If I wanted to practice doing play-by-play for basketball, and if anyone watching does, you could pretty much prepare for a game, especially now that they're re-airing all of these games. Let's say you look up the program guide and you see they're airing one of those Bulls 1998 games. Well, you could kind of look up the stats, the names, the people. You could probably make your chart and call it off TV and get some reps. And so that's kind of what I did with the horse racing. And I did it enough times to where I felt pretty good about it, that my heart was still beating when the gates opened and I was, calling it for real. But it's pretty much no experience like getting experience. So again, if I get a chance to do it again, even though it was a year ago, I think I'll feel better about it. But practicing on TV is, it's good practice.
You mentioned games re-airing NBA TV. About once the season was suspended, they released a free subscription to their services where you could watch. So how have you been taking kind of advantage of being able to watch these games back?
I've actually I have League Pass and I've been able to watch all of them. But what I have found myself doing in more of a half leisurely, half with an eye towards getting better is catching all the Fox Sports Indiana re-airs. I've probably not just sat there on my computer or called up a random game, but when it's come on Fox Sports Indiana and maybe it's after dinner and there's nothing on, I've been watching them, and I've probably critiqued maybe what I've done and some of my work from this past season a little bit more during this quarantine than I would normally. And I still say that that's something I probably could and should do more moving forward, because I think that's the way you get better, is to go back and to listen to yourself. So I've been watching a lot of the Pacers replays, and I've been trying to take special note of my work, my delivery, some of the post-game interviews. I think the halftime ones I feel pretty good about, especially the assistant coach interviews. Every time I watch one of those, I'm pretty happy with. Occasionally the walk-off interview, I've noticed some things that maybe I wasn't as aware of that I could try to do a little bit differently or a little bit better. But because that's such an important interview that, you could argue it's one of the most important things that I do on a nightly basis in terms of most people watching and trying to bring that emotion from the player to the fan. So I've just tried to take some notes, but also just tried to enjoy the presentation. And also I should actually pass along some respect to some of our behind the scenes crew. I think we have the best in the business, and Our director, Jamie Burns, does an outstanding job, and our producer, Max Linewand, and pregame producer, Ken Selfman. Some of the things that they're able to do and make things look smooth when it's not easy to do that, I've really taken note of during some of these replays.
I remember watching a few back with you on it. All the time, your delivery is really well and everything with that. So, how have you kind of prepared yourself before game to be ready for that delivery and be able to cover it?
It's similar to what I mentioned with the horse racing. When the light goes on, you've just got to be ready. And now that I've done it enough times, I think I have kind of my own style a little bit and confidence in the delivery. But I think that's even something that you just learn with practice. And I'll go back to my e-learning, and my son had to do a presentation on a project, and I found him kind of being a little timid and not really enunciating or using his voice as much. And I kind of tried to tell him, you got to speak up a little bit. You don't want to scream and yell, but your confidence can be portrayed through the camera. And so, as I'm trying to do with you, I like to try to bring energy to the broadcast. But even if you think you're bringing the energy, the one thing I've noticed is sometimes I think I was high energy or kind of had some enthusiasm. It takes even more than that to portray through the camera and then into someone's living room. And so it's one of the things that if I watch back, I kind of think back sometimes, that was kind of dry, or maybe that was kind of boring. It's hard to be up all the time, and you don't want to be fake in your enthusiasm. So I'm not saying that you need to be over the top, but I appreciate you saying that. And that's one of the things that I try to do. But in order to have a good segment or a good hit on a sideline report, a lot of that is just knowledge, because what I try to do is pitch, and I may have shared this in our sports broadcasting conference, but I'll try to pitch on a series of notes, maybe 5 different topics for a game to our producer, and I'll hand him that sheet of paper when we have our meeting before the games. And it's kind of written out what I might say, but it never comes out that way. But it's my way. Once I've written it out, then it's even better in my head. And so while sometimes I might have a clipboard that I'm holding, well, I'm not trying to be like right in front of me. I've got it in case there's a note or maybe a specific quote that I want to make sure that I, relay as accurately as possible. The best thing that you can do is have it all up here. And so maybe in the afternoon before a game, if I've written these notes out and presented them to the producer, go back and reread them, not memorizing them, but memorizing the content. So it's a big difference to me in the delivery. And sometimes even on the national shows, I'll watch a broadcast and I'll think that maybe the reporter is kind of memorizing, and that's not what you want. I don't think in your delivery, you want it to sound conversational. And that only comes with practice, but it also comes with just having that knowledge and having what you're getting ready to say become almost second nature. And I'm not perfect. There are times I'll do, especially that first hit that we usually do in the first quarter on camera. It's probably the important one because it's their chance to sort of introduce me in the game broadcast, but it's usually a very quick on-camera segment, and then the game's going to start, and I can't go on forever because there could be, a great play that happens right out of a timeout. And so that's the one that I think I could probably improve a little bit on, and really just make sure that first thing that I do, while we don't always know what it's going to be, sometimes it's game dependent. We'll usually say before a game, I'm thinking for my first hit, I want to do this, but it's always subject to change because let's say the Pacers go ahead 24-4 and Miles Turner has 15 points. Well, then I might change it to something that I already had ready for Miles instead of maybe the generic rebounding angle. Same token, let's say they're behind 24-12. I might just say, hey, Max, let's push this one to the next segment. See if we can get a little more of a positive vibe going before I get ready to try to, kind of pick people up.
You mentioned have to put like a positive spin on things. I feel like that's one of the hardest things about being a sports reporter is, especially when the team you're reporting for, they're down by so much points. I feel like teams like Phoenix and that's got to be kind of tough to report those kind of teams. So whenever the Pacers are down, what do you kind of look for to kind of change that angle up for the viewers themselves?
It is difficult because while, I am actually technically a Pacers employee, I also in a way work for Fox Sports in Indiana. And when we're at those games, I think the fans, they don't want just a sugar-coated broadcast. While I think that you could watch our show and feel like that, we're enthusiastic when they're doing well and maybe not as much so when they're not winning, we still have a job to do. And so there are always stories to tell. Sometimes it depends on how bad the deficit is. If it's really, a big margin, sometimes I'll have 3 or 4 angles that I've just kind of got in my back pocket, maybe of the, 12th or 13th man on the roster that don't get to play a lot, but maybe they've got an interesting story in their development. So the way I look at it is, no matter the game or the situation, there is always a story to tell. But also I have enough of understanding, and I admit that I'm not the reason people are watching. So I don't want to overdo it during the course of the game in terms of sideline reporting, but I've always got to be ready, in case in a different situation happens. So I do think that I'm a little bit, you can see that I have a little bit of fan in me. And if, for instance, I can remember a couple of games very specifically, there's usually a game ends, and if the Pacers lose, there's about a 90-second commercial, and I'm then right on the air for the post-game show. And I can remember the Toronto game this season, not the one they were blown out, but the one that they had about a 10 to 12 point lead with maybe a little under 2 minutes to play. And I really couldn't believe it. And if you watch the start of the post-game show, I tried to portray the dismay that I felt while not being offensive and attacking any one person for making the mistakes, but just, how did that happen? Well, we'll try to discuss it and things like that. And the other one vividly stands out was Game 5 of that playoff series against the Cavs, which has been replayed. I think Fox Sports Indiana replayed the wins. They didn't replay that one, but when LeBron James hit the buzzer beater to take a 3-2 lead in the series, I mean, that was one of those, and Victor Oladipo's goaltending was not called. And then immediately I've got to do the postgame show, and one of probably the most gut-wrenching losses that you'll cover. And off in the distance, I've got LeBron James standing on top of the scorer's table, going like that. And so it's a crazy scenario and circumstance, and it's not something that you can prepare for. You can have no notes of what you say when something like that happens. So you've just got to kind of say how you feel and be as professional as you can. But, I think the people watching would understand I felt a little bit of pain, much like they did.
You mentioned LeBron James, that celebration against the Pacers in Game 5. You guys kind of got sweet revenge back in 2019 of last year with a 40-point win against the Lakers. So reporting that kind of game with that much of a lead, what was that like for you?
It was fun, but I don't know that anything will kind of take away some of the pain the Pacers fans might feel from the multiple playoff exits. It was the one thing when he signed with the Lakers, I had mixed emotions. I mean, I'm not a big Lakers fan, and I was kind of going to grow weary of the nonstop coverage that you would get when you combine a team like the Lakers and a player like LeBron. So that was fun to call that game, and that was a huge blowout, and they were kind of team turmoil at the time because that was just prior to the trade deadline, and there were all these rumors that, I think even the Turner's Block was chanting LeBron's going to trade you, and guys were at the free throw line. So that was fun, but I don't think Pacers fans could boast too much about that. I probably enjoyed more the win from this past season in December because I think they had come into Bankers Life Fieldhouse having won, I think 12 out of 13, and they had maybe just lost either just previously, or I think they were undefeated maybe in road games. Maybe their only loss in a true road game was against the Clippers, which was in their home building. So that was they came in riding high, and to beat them at that point was fun. But still, at the end of the day, LeBron's knocked the Pacers out of the playoffs now 5 different times, right? That's what's a little frustrating.
Yeah. This past year, this year it's kind of like Oladipos coming off an injury, so it's got to be a little bit of a struggle with that on the team, him trying to find his groove back. Sabonis just coming off of All-Star selections. So how do you think that's going to affect the team going along with a former All-Star coming back and then having a current All-Star on the team?
I think it's great. You've seen and you see with, the Bulls, they had some good supporting cast members, but I don't know if Jordan would have been able to do that without Scottie Pippen. And so I think there's a foundation that the front office is putting together, and it does, appear as though Victor Oladipo and Domas Sabonis are such key parts to that. But Malcolm Brogdon could have been an all-star this past season, maybe if not for the number of injuries that he had in the first half. When he played, he was playing like an all-star. And I think that Miles Turner still has that in him. Maybe not a perennial all-star, but maybe someone that, depending on the year, has that capability. So I think they've still got a nice core. They're young. Victor Oladipo could be right at his sweet spot and needs to get a little bit more healthy. But there is some adjustment that they're having. I think it was good they got those games in. And whether it's this season or next season, I think that you'll continue to see bigger and better out of Oladipo. And that can only help to have then somebody like Sabonis, who was able to carry the team a little bit at times in the first half, join forces with Victor.
The game Victor came back was against Chicago. He hit that buzzer beater to tie the game up and send it to overtime. What was that kind of like being there at that moment of that buzzer beater?
Well, I mean, the anticipation and the buzz inside the building did rival a big playoff game. And so for a late January game against a Bulls team that, truthfully is not very good, it just was crazy how that was the biggest ticket, the hardest, the most texts I get from fans or friends. Hey, do you have extra tickets? Was for that night. And so everything about it was, pretty intense. But then during the game, he was just off a little bit. I mean, he hit a shot that kind of bounced around, maybe like a 15-foot jumper, but I think he was 0 for 6 from 3, and he just you knew he would be rusty, and he was. But then to have that opportunity and they call a timeout, and I listen to the timeouts sometimes late in the games. It's so loud, I really can't hear exactly what they're going to say, and I'm never going to be the person that comes on and does the Tony Romo and says, well, this is what Nate's going to do. I usually try to relay more themes and messages than specific plays. But I just remember thinking, like, of course he's going to shoot it, right? And, I thought he did it so quickly, maybe he caught the Bulls a little off guard, and he was so far back, you wouldn't guard him that far away from the basket. So it was almost like I barely had gotten back to my seat from listening to the huddle, and that ball's in the air, and then it was just kind of pandemonium. And when the game went to overtime, it was crazy because he had reached his minutes limit, and he was kind of taking his pads off and was putting ice on, and he was kind of shaking hands and congratulating everybody. And part of me said, well, they've still got to finish this game off or it's just not going to be as cool. But then I thought sometimes when I've seen enough games and if you cover enough of them, when that game went to overtime, there was no way the Pacers were going to lose, and they blew the Bulls out in OT.
There was one interview that you had with Oladipos that had a little bit of backlash on it. So how did you kind of handle that situation with the backlash you received?
I would say that with anybody, the more eyeballs that are on you and the more views that you have, there are always going to be more people that would find criticism. And so that interview, no matter what he would say on the court right after hitting a shot like that, it's going to go viral. It's going to get more attention. And obviously the emotions that he had and the way he felt lended some people to offer criticism. If you're in this position, you have to be able to accept it. I'll probably admit that I'm a little more thin-skinned than I should be, and I don't have to deal with that very often because, not to say I don't ever make mistakes, but it's rare that I think something comes out that's very negative or that it's a major mistake or that is could someone be highly critical of. So some people were critical, some people thought it was insensitive. I think we maybe discussed during the conference my thoughts on it. And I'm open to criticism and comments. And I tried to offer, if someone wanted to come at me directly and ask me or criticize, I tried to offer my response. But you can't really do that to every single one. You can go down a rabbit hole and it can consume you. So I don't think that it's crazy or not crazy, but, every situation is a learning experience. But I've even talked to Victor about it since, and I don't think that in any way that he was ready to go before he did go. So I don't think it would have been appropriate at the time in the middle of the second question to thank him without letting him have kind of his one opportunity to ask to speak to the fans or to try to say something else. And then he was so overcome with emotion, he wasn't able to. So if your question is how do I deal with it, I think you have to take any criticism as maybe valid, but then understand that sometimes there's a vocal minority on social media and know that that's a small percentage. And as long as you can feel good about what you do and your method and your reasons behind it, I think I can sleep well at night.
I want to talk a little bit about the Pacers season itself. So they're going on to they've been to the playoffs so much consecutively. I've honestly forgot the number, but they're going back to the playoffs this year. So how do you think they'll make their push if the season does return?
I think they're in a good spot just because their chemistry is so good, and the injuries had been a little bit of an issue all season. They even the last week before play was suspended, they had Malcolm Brogdon out. Jeremy Lamb obviously is someone who will be out a while, so he will not come back. But everyone else then should be healthy and they should be fresh. And I think that they're a team that genuinely gets along well together. To me, teams, if the season resumes, teams that like each other and really want to come back and don't just say it, or maybe they're just not concerned with the finances. I think they'll have better chemistry and they'll be able to get up to speed a little bit quicker. You mentioned the Pacers' history of making the playoffs, and I think there are guys that came to this team, and one of the reasons or one of the things they maybe were happy about would be the opportunity to play in the postseason. TJ Warren didn't have a choice, but one of the things he was super excited about playing for the Pacers is to have that postseason experience. So I think people around the league view the Pacers as a solid winning team that is expecting to go to the playoffs every year, and this is no different. Now they just want to break through and get a first-round win, which they've been unable to do in recent years.
Going forward, what teams do you think they'll struggle with the most? I mean, you've the Bucks, which is a powerhouse coming out of the East, as well as the Raptors. They're kind of expectedly successful this season. So what teams do you think they'll struggle with?
In the middle of the year, or maybe even December, January, I thought there was a clear top six. And I thought really then that maybe it was Milwaukee and then the next five teams. And I didn't think there was much difference, especially thinking about the Pacers projecting an Oladipo return in full health. But I thought that, Raptors, Celtics, Heat, it wouldn't be that big of a deal who you played, 76ers, that I thought it was the Bucks and everybody else. And then obviously maybe the teams in 7th and 8th that were another step down. I do think a little bit differently right now. And I think at least in early March, no one knows how teams are going to come back if they do come back. But I think the Bucks, the Celtics, and the Raptors are proven to be just a little bit better than those next three. And that's why I think it could be really good if the Pacers can stay in that 4-5 game, because the Heat would appear to me to be a good opponent for a first round. I probably would rather play the Heat than the Celtics. So given what happened last year in the playoffs against Boston and sort of what their starting five looks like, that to me would be a challenge. That would be one I would probably, if I was a Pacers fan or even a coach, I would be less excited about than to play either Philadelphia or Miami. Those are the two teams that if you play them in the first round, I think it'd be a good quality series. And I think the Pacers could have a chance at success.
So following the postseason is going to end up being free agency. Last free agency, you guys picked up Malcolm Brogdon. So what was it like being able to cover that big of a pickup for the Pacers?
Off season's kind of weird for me in my position because we don't really have programming in the summer. And so everything that happens in July and August, in some ways I'm a fan. And even there are some times in the summer, at least most Julys and August, but I'm not even allowed to talk about it. So I just kind of listen to the podcast like everyone else. And then if there's players brought in for a press conference to meet the media or have some initial one-on-ones, then I'll attend those. And sometimes I'll get a chance to sit down with some people. So the day that from this past off season, I did the one-on-one interviews for Pacers.com with Jeremy Lamb and TJ Warren the day they came in. And then I attended the press conference with Malcolm Brogdon. And I just thought it was an interesting summer because they pretty much remade the roster. They had a lot of guys who, had options or maybe were potential to bring back from a really good team. And they kind of went the other direction and kind of remade the roster. So I found it both exciting, but maybe a little nerve-wracking because you knew you had a solid group, but then you were going to change things up and you really didn't know how that would go. But I think Malcolm Brogdon was the one coming in, and everything he said on that first day that he came to Indiana about, I think it's important for Pacers fans. They just want to have guys that want to be here. Much like I said, I've always wanted to live in Indiana and work here. I mean, I think there is something to that. I mean, someone that grew up in Florida, nothing against them, but you don't have as much of a depth of knowledge and appreciation for the state if you're not from here. Now, these players could have not been from here, but if they genuinely want to be here, then I think it goes a long way. And I mean, Malcolm Brogdon has said and done all the right things since being since that deal was finished up in the summer. And I look forward to him being a cornerstone piece moving forward.
Going forward, we obviously see that the season's on suspension, but recently there's been some good news about June 1st being guidelines coming out about players coming back home to their team state and everything else with that. So what's your opinion on the season returning? Because I know you exactly don't know the exact details, but what's your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know the details, and I guess, much like what I said from previous summers when free agency happens, I'm a fan like anyone else. So, it would be disingenuous to say I'm not hoping that they can get something figured out. But at this point, as we record this in late May, I think they still, have some things that they're concerned with, and I'm just kind of on the outside looking in. So, I don't know that too many people watching would not say they would hope that they can figure something out. But other than that, it's just kind of hoping for the best at this point.
I hate to say it, but I'm going to end the interview here. I want to thank you for doing this with me, though. It was great having you on. So thank you for that.
Hey, no problem. I'm glad we got to catch up. Keep up the good work, Nathan. And, hopefully we can do it sometime again.
For sure. We'll have to check back in towards All-Star Weekend next year when the Pacers host it. So I'm sure you're looking forward to that. But if you want to check out the Shot Clock, you can check us out on Instagram, Twitter. Be sure to check us out on Apple Podcast and Spotify. This was Jeremiah Johnson joining us today. And thanks for watching the Shot Clock podcast.